Thank you, Professor Petrardino. Hi, I'm Nguyen from Caltech, and today I would like to present our project, the reduced order models for dynamic soil structure interaction analysis of various structures. The project is PI by Professor Damkia Shamki and co-PI by Professor Elna Salabi. So, as we all know, one of the most widely used method to analyze the soil structure interaction problem is the beam on dynamic winkler foundation method, in which the soil surrounding the structure is replaced by a set of springs and dashboards, aka the soil impedance functions, representing the soil reaction to the differential deformation between the soil and the structure. Many studies have investigated the dynamic soil impedance function for different types of foundations. For example, the strip foundation, embedded and pile foundation. Nevertheless, the soil impedance function and interaction model for spatially distributed berry structure have not been properly addressed until now. Even in the current guideline of ASE or American Lifeline Alliance, only soil spring stiffness in the static loading case is presented. So as a result, many researchers and engineers seek to very crude approximation, for example, the static stiffness coefficient or the equivalent like soil spring and damping coefficient in case of pile foundations. So accordingly, our work aims to propose a dual frequency and deformation dependent macro element model for time domain analysis of the seismic soil pile interaction. And in this presentation, we present the axial directions. As shown in the figure, the macro element consists of the near field element in series with the far field element. And the near field element represents the nonlinear characteristic and hysteresis loop or the damping or the material damping of the force displacement curve. The nonlinear hysteretic Backward model is a good choice for those purposes. However, as shown in the figures, with the original Backward model, we only able to simulate the force displacement curve in a very limited area, for example, the shaded area. So we modify the model, providing more flexibility to simulate the curve outside the shaded area. We implemented the modified Backward material in OpenSeas, and the near field element can be modeled by a zero length element combined with this 1D material. So for this material, there's kind of four main parameters input: the FU, the ultimate axial soil resistance; the K0, which is the initial elastic stiffness; the alpha, which is the ratio of the post-yield stiffness and initial stiffness; the kappa, which is the curvature of the force displacement curve. So for the far field element, we assume that outside the near field region, the soil behave elastic. And our previous work showed that the soil impedance function, in other words, the soil springs coefficient and dashboard damping coefficients, is a function of dimensionless frequency, and it varies with the burial depth. And to consider the nonlinearity of the interaction problem, we need to analyze the problem in time domains. Our previous result, the impedance function, are shown in frequency domain. So how to transfer from frequency domain to time domain? We have several methods. For example, the consistent lump parameter model or the discrete time filter, as Professor Chen presented before. Or we can use a system of spring, dashboard, and physical masses. The third one is stable simple and all of the elements already available in OpenSeas. But there is a problem. For example, with the physical mass, the system only works when it plays a role of an absorber. For example, in the case of pi subject to axial loading. But in case of soil pipeline or thermal interaction problem, when we apply the seismic excitation at the base of the macro elements, the physical mass will play a role of a vibrator. So it will generate the inertial force and modify the input excitation and contaminating the result. This phenomenon doesn't exist if we use the gyromass element. The gyromass element has the same dimension as physical mass, and it is defined as an independent unit system that generates the reaction force proportional with the relative acceleration between the two end nodes of the gyromass element. And we also implement the gyromass 1D material in OpenSeas to fit the target impedance function in frequency domain. We build a system with many blocks in series, and each block consists of spring, dashboard, gyromass in parallel with each other. For convenience, all of the spring stiffness, dashboard, damping coefficient, or the gyromass are expressed in dimensionless form. And we solve an optimization problem trying to find the values of spring stiffness, dashboard damping coefficient, and gyromass so that the impedance of the spring dashboard gyromass system fit the analytical impedance that we already have in frequency domain for both real part and imaginary part. So those figures show the analytical and fitting impedance for different cases of burial depth for both real part and imaginary part. We can see that the fitting impedance matches pretty well with the analytical solutions. And also here, you can see in each figure, we have a table showing the number of blocks that we use and the values of stiffness, damping coefficient, and gyromass value in each block in the dimensionless form. And that is very handy for the user. Here's the summary of the proposed model for dynamic axial interaction between the soil and buried structures such as pipe and tunnel. The surrounding soil is replaced by the macro element, which consists of the near field and far field elements. The near field element is responsible for simulating the deformation dependence and also the material damping of the soil in the vicinity of the pipe shaft. While the far field element is responsible for simulating the frequency dependence and also the radiational damping of the soil domain in far region. And the input for near field and far field element are highlighted in a different color. So the red color means that the parameters are obtained very easily with just a single equation from very basic geometrical and mechanical properties of the problems. The green color means that the parameter needs requires some calibration, usually from the static force displacement curve. And the blue parameter means that they're already given for the user via some graphs or tables, and only the ratio h over a, which is the burial depth over the pipe radius, is needed. So we validate our proposed model with a full-scale experiment conducted by Caltech et al. In 1982. So the input parameters for the proposed model is on the slide. This figure shows the force displacement curve at different frequencies in case of small displacement. We can see that the area enclosed by the force displacement loop represent the energy dissipated or the damping of the system. We can see here the damping increase with the increasing frequency, showing that this is the characteristic of the radiational damping. At low frequency, for example, at 0.1 Hertz and 3 Hertz, the area of the force displacement curve for two cases are almost the same, indicating that the damping is almost the same. This is because the material damping is dominant in low frequency, and that type of damping does not depend on the frequency. We can see that the proposed model is able to capture those trends, and it's also agree pretty well with the experiment data. For different displacement amplitudes at the low frequencies, the proposed model shows that the stiffness decreases with the increasing displacement amplitude. It represents the nonlinearity of the force displacement curve. Again, the proposed model is in good agreement with the experiment result. We also verify the proposed model with the result from the nonlinear finite element analysis, which is obtained via the MS Dynamic commercial software. So for nonlinear analysis in a finite element method, we build a two-step model. We apply the gravity in the first step and apply the harmonic displacement in the second step to obtain the force displacement curve. Those figures show the force displacement curve for the FEM result and proposed model. The solid lines are the result from the finite element method, and the dashed line is the result from our proposed model. So generally, we can see that two methods agree well with each other. And also when the frequency varies or the displacement amplitude varies, the slope and area enclosed by those force displacement curves change, indicating that the system stiffness and also the system damping coefficient change. For better comparison and interpretation, we calculated the equivalent real and imaginary part of the force displacement loop. So this figure shows the real part of the impedance of the whole system. It depends on the frequency and also the displacement amplitude. The red line here shows the analytical solution that we already have in the elastic region. We can see that in the small displacement, the system is linear elastic, and the impedance follow the theoretical solutions. But when the displacement is larger, the nonlinear behavior appear, and the real part of the impedance, for example, the slope of the force displacement curve, it decrease and reach nearly zero when the ultimate resistance is. And again, we can see a good agreement between those two methods. So this figure shows the imaginary part of the impedance of the whole system, and it depends on the frequency and the displacement amplitude. In the small displacement region, we can see that the system is linear elastic, and the impedance follow the theoretical solutions. We can see that the damping increases as frequency increase, representing the radiational damping, and there's no contribution for material damping. But when the displacement is larger, we have the nonlinearity, and the damping start to decrease in all frequency and finally reach a constant value. So the damping in this case mostly material damping and does not depend on frequencies. In conclusion, we propose a dual frequency and deformation dependent macroelement model for time domain analysis of seismic axial solid pipe interaction, in which we implemented two new material models for the OpenSeas users. Next step, we're going to propose a similar model for lateral and vertical interaction problems, and we then apply those models to analyze the pipeline autonomous system subjected to the surface wave propagation. Yeah, thank you for listening.